Hey guys, welcome back to The Good Part, where we remember that He is all that you need. In today's video, we're going to be talking about boundaries. Let's get into it.
Hey guys, thanks again for joining us today on The Good Part. Just like Bianca said, today we're talking about boundaries. But before we get into the video on boundaries, I just wanted to take some time out to say thank you to everybody that took the time to watch that video that we had and sharing and liking and even subscribing on our video on how to budget as a couple and how God saved us in our marriage. So if you haven't checked that video out, it's in the card, so go ahead and click that link after watching this video. And again, don't forget to like, to comment, and subscribe for more videos. So today we're talking about boundaries. And boundaries in particular in a relationship. In another video, we're going to talk about boundaries with family members, which that one's going to be a whole big topic on its own. But we want to just take the time out to discuss how can we create boundaries in our relationships for those that are married, as well as maybe those that might be single or in the dating or courting season of their lives. One thing that I thought of as we were coming up with this topic, I thought of the idea that love is not enough. And what I mean by that is, like, if we have a love or an environment, right, that's either hostile or unfriendly to boundaries, our love will eventually fail. It won't flourish or even grow simply because of the fact that we can't have or we don't have what are called healthy boundaries.
Yeah.
In fact, a couple of weeks ago, Will and Jada Smith, they had this thing on social media where they were popping. They made this comment at the end of the clip that we watched, and they said something to the effect of, like, they were celebrating bad marriage for life.
And I don't think it's about getting anybody back.
No, for me it is.
Okay. I'll give you that petty if that's what you want. But, you know, I will definitely say it's just part of it.
Yeah.
You know, if you expect to be with somebody for a lifetime.
25 years and counting.
We ride together.
We die together.
Bad marriage for life.
I remember we watched it and we looked at each other and kind of cringed, right? Just because that's not what God desires for any relationship, yet alone a marriage. But I believe, like, most people, like, are legitimately in that situation where, because they haven't found a way to set up healthy boundaries, they're probably in a relationship that's unfulfilling, or even themselves, they're unhappy. Even to the point where we can say maybe there were boundaries, but there's like a breakdown of those boundaries in which the partners never actually express, hey, this is as far as you can go before you're actually now crossing my line. So when we get into this idea of, like, what is a boundary anyway, the way I can think of it is just, it's when you can find a way to say, this is as far as you can go, but no further. Like, this is where my line is, and you can't cross that line. So now, like, as important as that can sound, like, you know, having those healthy boundaries set up for yourself, I believe a lot of us actually, not that we don't know how to create a boundary, we're inconsistent in establishing healthy boundaries throughout all aspects of relationships, or even life for that matter, to where sometimes it can actually become quite difficult to know, like, when your partner has actually crossed your boundary. Or even be able to, how do you now tell them, like, I want to establish a boundary when maybe this whole time in your relationship you haven't said anything.
Yeah.
Like, for example, for me, I remember there have been times, or there was one very particular time in our relationship where I noticed something was happening and I felt like I needed to say something. I needed to establish this boundary now before, you know, things get crazy. But I feared the reaction that you would have to my boundary more so than I feared what would happen if we continued to go down that path. And I think that's where a lot of people are, where we fear the reaction of our partner, so we kind of just maintain the status quo. We allow, you know, those negative feelings to stir up and eventually just do nothing. And we find ourselves in this place where we're hurting, but because we want to keep up appearances or stay in that relationship, we don't do anything further in order to actually set up those boundaries. But why don't you kind of explain to us and dive into, like, this idea, how do I set up a proper boundary?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like, for the most part, we all know what we want or what our boundaries are, right? We have an idea of, okay, like, this is what my expectation is, or this is where I'm gonna draw the line. But when it comes to setting those boundaries, that's where it gets a little tricky, or where it's hard to tell someone like, no, you can't cross that line. Or maybe it's not hard to tell them, but it's hard to do something about it when they do cross that line. So I feel like with setting boundaries, it's important to make sure we communicate our thoughts with, our significant other. So communicating to me is not just saying, I don't like when you do that, but going a step further to even explain why I don't like it and how that thing that you do makes me feel. Because I feel like if you just say to someone, I don't like when you do that, they may continue to do it because there's not really necessarily that understanding of, well, okay, you just don't like it, but why don't you like it? But when you go a step further to explain how that action makes you feel and why you don't like it, the next time your significant other may think twice before they do something, And again, with communicating, it's important to do it just because someone may do something wrong where they may cross a boundary and not know that they're crossing your boundary because you never communicated that in the first place. And I think another thing too when it comes to setting boundaries is to never assume or guess what your partner is thinking, right? You can't just assume like, oh, everything's good, they're happy, or you can't assume they know that that thing they're doing is crossing my boundary and it's upsetting me, because they don't know. It's always important to ask and to share with your significant other those things that may be of a bother to you, or to ask, why do you continue to do this thing? Because you can't just assume like they know what they're doing, they know they're crossing my boundary, because sometimes people genuinely just don't know. So we can't just assume they're intentionally crossing a boundary or intentionally, I guess, maybe disrespecting you.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with that too, actually, in terms of I usually like to assume people know, because in my mind, some of these things are basic. So I struggle, like, I know we've had issues where sometimes I'm like, why is Bianca not realizing this? Because for me, I definitely or genuinely feel it's a basic boundary.
Yeah.
But I love the point you're making, like, don't assume. Why don't you just ask, or even make it known if you're the one that has the boundary that's being crossed?
Exactly. Yeah. I think it's easy for a lot of us to assume because, right, we just think like everyone should know what I know. Especially my significant other should know what I know, or know how I think, or think the same way as me. So we generally assume, but it's important for us to not do that, but to just communicate from the beginning. And then another thing too, when you're setting boundaries, is to always follow through on what you say. And when I think of that, I think of like with Uriah. With him, like now he's at a stage where he likes to touch cords and just touch things he shouldn't touch. If we just say, no, don't do that, but don't do anything else beyond that, and just say no, and he continues to do it and all we say is no, he just starts to think we're playing with him, and he'll continue to do it, and he'll continue to push that limit because there hasn't been a consequence to him doing it, or when he touches it, we don't remove him from those cords and make sure he knows like, okay, don't do that. And I think that's the same way when you set a boundary. You need to follow through on what you say. So if you say like, hey, I don't like when you disregard my feelings when I share with you how I feel, or when you like make fun or ignore what I'm saying, and then you say, if you continue to do that, then I'm gonna withdraw and stop sharing. That's you setting the boundary. But if that continues to happen to where you share your feelings and your significant other continues to like kind of belittle and say, oh, that's not that big of a deal, and you continue to do it and you just end up feeling bad and you don't follow through with that boundary that you set, they're not gonna say, oh, okay, let me stop doing that. They'll continue to do it because to them it's like, well, it's not that big of a deal if I play around or if I just make fun a little bit because you didn't follow through on your boundary. Whereas if you follow through and say, okay, I told you that if you continue to do that, then I'm not going to share as much with you anymore because you're not considering my feelings. Then as you stop sharing, they may realize like, dang, they're not sharing with me as much as they used to before, and start to move differently and respect that boundary because they want to gain access into your feelings again and to know what's going on with you. So it's really important, I feel, to always follow through with what you say. When you set a boundary, follow through with that consequence rather than allowing someone to continue to cross that boundary over and over again, because then it has no meaning.
But you know, you have to mention, like, you have to follow through with an appropriate consequence.
Yeah, for sure, because I think it turns into a thing of being spiteful or being petty, instead of, you know, protecting yourself and saying, okay, this is my boundary and I want it respected, so let me set this appropriate consequence in order for that boundary to be respected. It turns into a thing of like, well, I don't like when you do this, so let me be spiteful or be petty to get you back by setting this like crazy consequence, you know, just to get you back. And I feel like there's a fine line between setting like a healthy, good boundary and taking things overboard just because you're trying to get back at the other person. So I think another step too is taking responsibility for your actions. So I feel like even in situations where someone crosses a boundary or does us wrong, we also have a part to play, right? You show people how to treat you, you know? So if I'm continuing to just be passive and be a pushover and kind of let you do whatever you want, disrespect my boundaries, and I just sit there and take it, I'm essentially letting you know with my actions that it's okay for you to do whatever you're doing. So if I want something to change, I have to take ownership of my actions and say, okay, me kind of being passive and me letting things go is me enabling this behavior. So I have to take responsibility and say, okay, partly this is my fault, and if I don't change, this will continue. But if I change and set the standard and say, this is my boundary and this is the consequence, and I'm no longer going to sit back and just take it, then that will allow for that boundary to be set and for things to start happening as I take ownership of my own actions and say, okay, I did play a part in this, so let me change this and let me set this boundary and now follow through with what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think one thing to mention, like, boundaries are not meant to be like a threat or even something that's super forceful. I think boundaries are great, and they actually are a great expression of love, right? Because even in our relationship with Christ, Christ has boundaries even with us. Like, if, you know, you do this and this, it ends up leading, you know, ultimately not to making it to heaven. And I think that's one thing we have to keep in mind as we talk about this. It's not about, I'm setting my boundary, I'm about to show you, you know, where I'm coming from. But it's about establishing true love.
And I think lastly, too, with setting boundaries, is just knowing when it's time to move on, right? And I feel like this is tricky because, you know, we're talking relationships in general. So, like, you know, if I'm talking to someone who's married, I'm never going to be like, yeah, just go ahead and divorce and move on, you know, like, that's not what I'm saying. If you're just in like a dating relationship, you definitely don't ignore red flags. I feel like if your boundaries are being disrespected in a dating relationship, it's okay to just go ahead and walk out that door, because if it's happening so frequently in a dating relationship, you can only imagine what it's going to be like when you're married. That really kind of wraps it up for steps that you can take to setting boundaries. I mean, there are other ways too you can take to set boundaries that may look different based on, you know, what each individual situation is like. But yeah, it's important to just make sure we communicate.
Yes.
We should never assume, and we should always follow through with what we say. And I think that also taking responsibility for our own actions really sets us up to set healthy boundaries.
Yeah, I feel like, and actually that transitions so well into this next section where we're talking about how do you now set boundaries with yourself? You know, earlier I started with like setting boundaries is not about learning how to control somebody else, but rather learning the art or even the fruit of the spirit, which is self-control.
Yeah.
And one of the verses comes from Matthew 7. I wanted to read it here for you. It says, "And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Like, why I love this verse is because Jesus was just clearly exemplifying the importance of checking yourself first before you get into talking with somebody else. And it's the same thing in boundary setting. you have to learn how to take ownership, like you said, for your own mess first, right?
Yeah.
How am I contributing to the problem? Did I even clearly communicate my boundaries, like you mentioned, right? And then the next step is just learning how to remove the plank, like the Bible said, from your own eye, so that you can actually now see the, the issue clearly. So you can actually have a decision like, okay, Bianca, you actually are the one that has the issue. Or maybe no, it's actually not with Bianca, it's with me. I've never actually set that boundary itself. It's all about learning how to change what you have the power to control, as opposed to trying to have power over other people.
Yeah, that's true.
And one of the things I thought about when I was going through this section here, so like, let me ask you this, like when somebody hurts someone, right? The majority of us, who do we think is now in charge or has the onus to fix things when someone has hurt somebody? The victim or the one that did the hurting?
The one who hurt me, fix it.
Right. That's how we feel, right? But God actually designed it in another way. In two sections of the Bible, both in Matthew, one in Matthew 18 and then one in Matthew 5, I believe. We'll look that up. But it talks about how God wants, whether I'm the victim or the one that did the hurting, in both situations, I'm supposed to come to that person and reconcile our differences. Yeah. So example, like if I hurt you, I need to be the one that rushes to make up with you. In the same way, now, if you hurt me, this is the one where you kind of swallow your pride, right? You have to be the one to now go and approach the one that hurt you and state why they hurt you, what's going on. And that gives you that opportunity now to actually set that boundary. So it's all about learning how to take ownership for your own self, set those boundaries for your own self, know what you live by, and then live by those same rules as you go forward. But now let's talk a little bit about let's talk about intruders, right? How do we protect our relationships from intruders with our boundaries?
Okay, so yeah, I feel like most times when people think like intruders in a relationship, or when someone says, oh, intruder in a relationship, we think of other people, right? And I think more times than not, we think of the opposite sex when we think of other people. But I feel like, intruders come from a number of angles and from all different kind of things. So like an intruder could be, our phones, technology, work, friends and family, kids, and even addictions, right? So how do we protect our relationship from those things, right? In the book, one of the things that it said was a relationship is only as strong as what it costs to protect it, right? And basically what it's saying is you value what you invest in. So if we value our marriage, if we value our relationship, we should be pouring into it, right? Rather than just ignoring it and saying, oh, everything's good between us. There's nothing wrong, right? There's nothing wrong yet. So we continue to do other things, whether it be like you focus on work, I focus on, what I want to focus on, whether we're focusing on hanging out with our friends. If we're pouring into the intruders, then it'll eventually become a problem. It may not be a problem now, but later on it will be if we're not investing in us and pouring into us. So I think how you protect your relationship is basically by investing in your relationship and pour into it. Make sure you're taking the time to check in on one another. Make sure you're taking the time to go over those boundaries again, and to make sure you're not allowing that actually you're setting healthy boundaries with all those different intruders, even the good intruders, right? Even the positive stuff, making sure you're setting those boundaries ahead of time to avoid having to patch up those problems later that may come up because of that.
Now, let me pause you real quick. So earlier, I think a few weeks ago, we talked about an experience that you had. Now, speaking of intruders or even setting proper boundaries, you shared with me like an experience that you had where people were kind of, I guess, in a way teaching you how to have a boundary. Whether or not it was healthy, I don't know. I want you to kind of dive into that a little bit if you feel comfortable sharing that experience.
I feel like a lot of times women are looked at as strong, who like ignore things and just power through these tough times and not set boundaries, but allow, the man to be a man, as they say. And even though it's looked as strong, I don't believe that it's strong, but rather I think it chips away at you little by little. You know, it just takes and takes from you until there's nothing left to take. So
so in other words, when an intruder does come, social media, even kids, your job, you know, or someone of the opposite sex, or even of the same sex as your partner, you still have to meet it. You shouldn't shy away from it.
Yeah, you don't ignore it. You definitely shouldn't shy away from it before it even becomes a thing. Even if you're thinking to yourself, I know I do this a lot, I'm like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. Before it becomes a big deal, you know, address it, talk about it. It doesn't mean it has to be a fight. You know, it shouldn't even be. But it should be one of those things where you talk about it ahead of time. Talk about it before it becomes a problem, you know, and just make sure that those boundaries are set, that we have an understanding between one another when it comes to those outside things. Because essentially anything outside of our marriage, even like our kids, you know, technically those are intruders to your marriage. Even all the positive stuff, anything outside of us can become an intruder if we allow it to. So I think it's fair and it's safe and healthy to talk about those things and talk about how we navigate around those things as a couple.
So essentially, when it comes to setting up boundaries, it just seems like you can't allow intruders to affect you. You have to learn how to set those boundaries for yourself, and even know what it, you know, some of those proper steps, communication, follow up and follow through. All of these things together prepare us not only to create healthy boundaries, but to make sure we're able to maintain those healthy boundaries in our relationships. So yeah, one thing that I did want to mention before we close today is just like we need to remember to avoid the misuse of boundaries, right? Boundaries are not meant to end a relationship unless maybe you're dating. If things don't go well, then you end the relationship. But boundaries are meant to deepen your relationship. So thanks guys for watching this video today on boundaries. Let us know in the comment section below. Do you guys believe in boundaries in a relationship? Why or why not? So thanks again for watching. Don't forget to comment, to like, and to subscribe. And stay tuned for part 2 where we discuss boundaries with your family.
That's gonna be a good one.
Peace.
Bye.